Welcome to Scoli Sleep Stories. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let the day soften around you and settle in for a calm documentary made for curious minds. If these stories help you rest, learn, or simply enjoy a quieter part of the day, please consider liking this episode and subscribing to the channel. Now, when you are ready, let us begin. Chapter 1: 26 Familiar Shapes. On a sheet of cream-colored paper beneath warm lamplight, a line of letters waits quietly. A, B, C, D. The sequence is so familiar that the eye moves along it almost without thought. A fingertip might follow the shapes from left to right, passing over peaks and curves, open spaces and crossing lines. Dark ink rests within the fibers of the page. Each letter seems simple, complete, and entirely at home. There are 26 letters in the alphabet used for modern English. They can be written as capitals or in smaller forms: A and A, B and B, C and C. We encounter them on signs and screens, in books and notebooks, on labels, maps, clocks, and calendars. They help us record an ordinary afternoon, a scientific idea, a remembered name, or a story carried across generations. Yet these 26 familiar shapes were not created all at once, nor were they invented especially for the English language. What we call the English alphabet is mainly a 26-letter version of the Latin alphabet, also known as the Roman alphabet. English adopted these letters and adapted their use over a long period. Before that, Roman writers had inherited and reshaped an older tradition. That tradition in turn had traveled through other languages, other lands, and other hands. The history of the alphabet is not the story of a single inventor sitting down to design a perfect set of signs. It is a gentler and more gradual story. It is a story of borrowing, adaptation, and reinterpretation. A community receives a way of writing from its neighbors. It keeps some signs, changes others, and perhaps sets a few aside. A shape that once represented one sound may come to represent another. A sign may turn, simplify, or acquire a longer stroke. Centuries later, another community borrows the altered set and changes it once more. In a broad and simplified form, the path leading toward the English alphabet can be pictured like this. Egyptian signs led toward early alphabetic writing in Egypt and Sinai. That writing was related to the tradition that became Phoenician. Phoenician signs were adapted by Greek writers. Greek forms traveled into ancient Italy, where they were used and changed by the Etruscans. From these traditions came the Latin alphabet of Rome, and in time Latin letters became the main letters used to write English. It is a long path, so there is no need to remember every stage at once. For now, the names may simply rest in order: Egyptian, early alphabetic, Phoenician, Greek, Etruscan, Latin, English. This is a useful line of descent, though it is not a perfectly straight road or a complete family tree. Ancient writing did not pass neatly from one person to the next in a single, unbroken sequence. Several regional forms existed beside one another. Travelers, craftspeople, merchants, officials, and scribes encountered different styles. They carried habits from one place to another, sometimes preserving a sign and sometimes reshaping it. Some of the earliest stages remain uncertain because only a small number of inscriptions have survived. The alphabet's history therefore resembles a river with several channels, more than a single narrow thread. Some channels join, others fade, a few can be traced clearly across the landscape, while others disappear beneath the ground and seem to emerge again farther on. Even the word alphabet carries a memory of this long journey. It comes into English through Greek, from the names of the first two Greek letters, alpha and beta. Their names sound different from our plain A and B, yet their position at the beginning feels deeply familiar. The order of the letters is ancient too. Much of the sequence can be traced backward through Greek and Phoenician traditions. A before B and B before the letter that eventually became C. This arrangement is far older than modern English. People preserved much of the sequence, even while they changed the shapes and the sounds associated with them. To understand that history, it helps to separate two things that often seem closely joined: a letter and a sound. A letter is a written sign. It is something seen on a page, carved into a surface, or traced by hand. A sound belongs to speech. It is made by the voice and heard by the ear. Letters can represent sounds, but the connection is not always simple. English does not use a system in which every letter has exactly one sound and every sound has exactly one letter. The letter C, for example, represents one sound in cat and another in city. The same written shape performs different work according to the word around it. English also has more than 26 speech sounds. The exact number varies somewhat between accents, but it is greater than the number of letters. To represent those sounds, English often combines letters, as in SH, CH, or TH. Sometimes one sound has several possible spellings. Sometimes a familiar letter remains within a word, even though it is no longer pronounced. This irregularity is part of the alphabet's history. English spelling contains layers from different periods and languages, rather like faint lines visible beneath a later drawing. An older form may remain quietly present, even after pronunciation has moved on. Not every writing system organizes language in the same way. Alphabets use signs to represent individual speech sounds, including consonants and vowels. A consonant is made with some narrowing or closure in the mouth. A vowel is formed with a more open flow of air. Other writing systems may work differently. A syllabary uses signs for whole syllables, such as ma or ko. A consonantal script records mainly consonants, leaving many vowels to be understood from context. Still other systems use signs connected with whole words or meanings. These different approaches are not simply steps on a ladder from less developed to more developed. Each can be rich, precise, and well-suited to the language and culture that uses it. Human beings have discovered many ways to place speech, thought, memory, and meaning into visible form. The modern English page also contains another quiet piece of history, uppercase and lowercase letters resting side by side. They may appear to be matched pairs, designed together from the beginning, A and A, B and B, D and D. Yet capitals and lowercase letters were not born together. Many modern uppercase shapes owe much to the formal capital letters carved on Roman monuments. Those letters were intended to be clear and lasting, with balanced lines suited to stone. Lowercase forms developed later and more gradually. They grew from quicker styles of handwriting, especially during the medieval period, when scribes copied text by hand. A pen moving across parchment naturally rounded some forms, joined certain strokes, and simplified others. The needs of a moving hand were different from the needs of a chisel meeting stone. Over time, these handwritten forms became established as a second set. Today, uppercase and lowercase letters rest together so comfortably that their separate histories can be easy to overlook. Not all 26 modern letters are equally ancient either. J, for example, was once treated as a form of I. U and V were also long regarded as variations of a single letter. Their separate identities emerged comparatively recently after centuries of changing habits. So even the alphabet that now appears stable contains signs of gradual change. Some letters have held recognizable places for a very long time. Others found their modern roles much later. The set was not completed in one workshop or settled in one generation. The alphabet before us is therefore both ordinary and remarkable. Its letters seem still, yet each one has been shaped by movement. They have crossed seas and borders. They have passed among speakers of many languages. Their ancestors appeared on carved stone, wax tablets, papyrus, and parchment. Later forms were arranged in metal type, pressed into paper, and eventually carried into the quiet light of a screen. Through all these changes, letters remain tools in human hands. A stonecutter could give a capital letter weight and balance. A scribe could soften it through the movement of a pen. A printer could repeat it with metal type. A reader could meet it again under lamplight, without needing to know how far it had traveled. There is no need to hold the whole journey in mind at once. For now it is enough to notice that the familiar line from A to Z has a deep ancestry. Every curve and stroke belongs to a long inheritance, received and revised by people who spoke many languages and lived in many different places. The English alphabet was not independently created for English. It arrived through a long history of borrowing and adjustment. Its letters were accepted, repurposed, and made familiar. Even their order carries an ancient memory, and before letters could stand for sounds in this compact way, human beings had already created rich and sophisticated systems for preserving names, goods, prayers, laws, stories, and memory. Those systems were not early versions of the English alphabet. They followed their own principles and served their own societies. Yet they belong to the wider human history of writing, the long effort to make language visible, and to let a thought remain after the voice has grown quiet. So we may leave the modern page beneath its warm lamp. The 26 letters can rest there, dark against the cream-colored paper, while the path of their ancestry leads gently backward. Beyond the page are older surfaces and older rooms. There is damp clay waiting for the touch of a stylus. There are painted signs, carved walls, and records kept by careful hands. Long before the alphabet reached its familiar form, people were already finding enduring ways to preserve the written word. Chapter 2. Before the Alphabet. Long before anyone arranged the ancestors of our letters into a familiar sequence, writing was already ancient. Across parts of the early Middle East and northeastern Africa, people had learned to preserve language in visible form. They recorded harvests and offerings, named rulers and officials, marked ownership, copied prayers, settled accounts, and remembered events. Their systems did not look much like the modern English alphabet, nor were they merely early drafts of it. They were complete traditions of writing, shaped for their own languages, purposes, and societies. One of these traditions arose in Mesopotamia, the broad region around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, mostly within what is now Iraq. From the late 4th millennium BCE onward, scribes there wrote upon clay. Clay was an abundant and patient material. When damp, it yielded beneath the hand. A scribe could take a reed, cut its end into a firm edge, and press it into the soft surface of a small tablet. The corner of the reed left a neat impression, narrow at one end and wider at the other. By changing the angle and position of each press, the scribe formed orderly rows of small marks. These impressions resembled wedges. Much later, the writing came to be called cuneiform, a name meaning wedge-shaped. A finished tablet might be left to dry in the warm air. Some tablets were baked deliberately, others hardened gradually over time, or were preserved by chance. On their surfaces, the wedge marks remained, holding quiet rows of information within earth. Cuneiform was not one unchanging code. It developed across a very long span of history, and it was adapted for several languages over thousands of years. Its signs could work in different ways, depending on the place, the period, and the purpose of a text. A sign might represent an entire word. It might stand for a syllable, a unit of speech such as ba or ku. Other signs could provide additional information, helping a reader understand the meaning or category of a word. In this way, different kinds of signs worked together. This variety made cuneiform intricate, but intricacy was not a flaw. Trained scribes understood how its signs combined. They learned patiently through practice, copying lists and model texts until the movements of the reed became familiar. With time, the pressing of one wedge after another could become a practiced rhythm, each mark placed carefully in the yielding clay. The system served merchants, administrators, scholars, rulers, priests, and poets. Accounts could be kept, messages could travel, legal decisions, mathematical exercises, letters, medical observations, and works of literature could all rest within its patterns. Cuneiform was therefore not an incomplete alphabet. It followed different principles and met different needs. Its many signs belonged to a world in which writing, education, government, trade, and memory had grown closely connected. Farther west, along the Nile, another great writing tradition was taking shape. Egyptian hieroglyphic writing also developed from the late 4th millennium BCE onward. Its formal signs often had recognizable forms. A reader might see a bird, a hand, a plant, a vessel, a seated figure, or part of an animal. Carved into stone or painted in color, the signs could appear almost like small images, carefully balanced and arranged. Yet hieroglyphs were not simply pictures to be understood by looking at them. They formed a sophisticated writing system. Some signs could express whole words or ideas. Some represented combinations of consonants. Others represented individual consonants. Additional signs could help clarify the meaning of a word, gently guiding the reader toward its intended sense. All these kinds of signs could work side by side. Egyptian writing was therefore not simply an alphabet, even though it included signs associated with single consonants. One alphabet-like feature did not make the whole system alphabetic. The complete tradition depended upon many kinds of signs, performing different tasks together. Egyptian writing also appeared on many different materials. On monuments and tomb walls, signs could be cut into stone, where shallow light touched the edges of each carved line. Writing could also be placed upon wood and pottery fragments. For longer documents, Egyptians often used papyrus, made from the papyrus plant that grew along the Nile. The inner fibers of the plant were arranged in crossing layers, then pressed, dried, and joined into sheets. Across the pale surface, a writer could move a reed brush or pen. Nearby might stand small dishes of dark ink and mineral pigment. The hand followed the faint texture of the papyrus fibers, leaving names, calculations, instructions, stories, or sacred words. There was a quiet difference between writing carved for a monument and writing placed swiftly upon a practical document. The elaborate hieroglyphs familiar from temple walls existed alongside quicker, more cursive forms of Egyptian handwriting. Scribes did not carve every daily record as though it were a royal monument. Flowing handwritten traditions allowed them to write more efficiently with ink. Formal and practical styles belonged to the same broad literate culture. Each was suited to a different setting. Stone offered permanence and ceremony. Papyrus allowed the hand to travel more freely. Wood and pottery fragments provided other surfaces for signs, depending on the needs of the moment. It can be tempting to imagine that early writing everywhere began as pictures, and then followed a single path, gradually becoming letters. The real history is more branching than that. Human communities developed and adapted writing in different ways. A visible sign might represent an object in one context, a whole word in another, or part of a spoken sound in another. Writing systems borrowed ideas, altered old signs, and created new conventions. But there was no universal staircase that every tradition climbed, one step at a time, toward the alphabet. Cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphic writing were not primitive or unfinished attempts to produce alphabetic letters. They were sophisticated systems, well suited to the languages and societies that used them. Their complexity was not something waiting to be corrected. It was part of how they worked. Nor did the alphabet appear and immediately replace these older traditions. Cuneiform and Egyptian writing continued because they were established, useful, and deeply woven into their cultures. New and old methods could exist beside one another for centuries. A new approach to writing did not cause every earlier practice to vanish. This gives us a calmer way to imagine the ancient written world. It was not a single road leading directly toward the 26 English letters. It was more like a landscape crossed by many paths. Along one path, a scribe pressed a cut reed into damp clay. Rows of wedge-shaped marks dried in the warm air. Along another, a craftsperson carved balanced signs into stone, while shallow light settled into the incised lines. Elsewhere, a writer drew a reed across papyrus, over fibers laid in crossing layers, while dark ink rested in a small dish nearby. Each surface invited a different movement of the hand. Each writing tradition carried its own habits, knowledge, and history. Still, Egyptian writing does matter to the ancestry of the alphabet. Some Egyptian signs would later be seen and adapted by people seeking another way to connect visible marks with speech. Yet the modern English alphabet is not merely a shortened collection of hieroglyphs. Between an Egyptian sign and an English letter lie many acts of borrowing, reinterpretation, and change. For now, the important thought is simple. Before the alphabet, writing already had a long history. Clay tablets were covered in orderly wedges. Stone walls carried carefully arranged signs. Wood and pottery held their own records. Papyrus received the gentle movement of reed and ink. Different systems preserved language by different means, and each was capable of subtle and enduring expression. The earliest alphabets emerged within this already literate world. They appeared among established traditions, familiar materials, and people who already understood that language could be made visible. The alphabet was not the beginning of writing itself. It was one particular development within a much older human practice. Writing had many paths before one path began to lead toward alphabetic signs. From the many marked tablets of Mesopotamia and the full painted and carved texts of Egypt, our view can now narrow. We will turn toward a small number of rough inscriptions associated with Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula. Their surviving marks are sparse, weathered, and sometimes difficult to interpret. The evidence leaves room for uncertainty. Yet within those marks, scholars may glimpse an important adaptation, the use of a familiar sign chiefly for a sound, especially the sound heard at the beginning of its name. Chapter 3. Signs Become Sounds. Our path now narrows from the crowded surfaces of ancient tablets and temple walls to a handful of quiet marks, They are found upon stone in places where the land is dry and open and where sunlight rests for long hours on pale rock. Some signs are shallow and uncertain. Dust lies in their carved grooves. Others faintly suggest a head, a house, an eye, or a simple tool. These inscriptions are placed broadly within the 2nd millennium BCE, although their exact dates remain debated. They come from places including Wadi el-Hol in Egypt and Sarabat el-Qadim in the Sinai Peninsula. Scholars have given them several names. Some call them Proto-Sinaitic, others use Proto-Canaanite. Still others prefer the more cautious description, early alphabetic writing. Each name reflects an attempt to understand what these marks were, who made them, and how they may have been related to later scripts. Yet the surviving evidence is small. A few weathered inscriptions must carry the weight of many questions, and they cannot answer all of them. This uncertainty need not trouble us. The distant past often reaches the present in fragments, a broken vessel, a worn inscription, a line preserved upon stone. Knowledge can remain meaningful even when it is incomplete. We may see the broad outline of a change without knowing every person, place, or year involved. Sarabat el-Qadim was associated with Egyptian mining and temple activity. People came and went through this landscape, and Egyptian writing would have been present there in formal inscriptions. Among those who encountered these signs were probably speakers of Semitic languages. Many scholars think that some Semitic-speaking writers adapted selected Egyptian signs for a new purpose. We do not know exactly who these writers were. Their identities, occupations, and levels of literacy remain uncertain. They may have been workers, craftspeople, officials, or people whose roles are no longer clear to us. We cannot be sure how much Egyptian writing they understood. Their knowledge may have come through teaching, practical familiarity, or simple observation. No single person can accurately be named as the inventor of the alphabet. Instead, the earliest alphabetic tradition seems to have emerged gradually, through borrowing and adaptation. Someone familiar with Egyptian signs, or at least with their visible forms, found a different way to connect a sign with speech. The change was modest in appearance, yet far-reaching in effect. To understand this change, imagine a simple picture of a house. In a pictorial system, that sign might refer to a house, or it might take part in writing a larger word. An early alphabetic writer, however, could use it in another way. First, the writer named the pictured object in the writer's own language. A Semitic word for house was beth, or a closely related form. Then, the writer took only the first consonant sound of that word. The sound we represent as B. The house sign could therefore stand for B, without necessarily meaning an actual house. This method is called the acrophonic principle. The name may sound unfamiliar, but the idea is simple. A picture is named, and the sign comes to represent the first consonant sound in that name, so a house becomes a B sound. The sign is no longer tied only to the object it resembles. It can be placed wherever that sound is needed. It can move from word to word, carrying the same consonant with it. This was an important conceptual shift. A visible image could be used chiefly for a sound, rather than only for an object, an idea, or a complete word. With a limited set of such signs, writers could represent many different words. The signs became flexible. They could be combined and rearranged according to the sounds of speech. Other early letter names may preserve similar memories, although these possible lines of ancestry must be treated cautiously. Aleph, which later became Greek alpha, may descend from a stylized sign resembling the head of an ox. Beth, later Greek beta, was associated with a Semitic word for house. Mem was associated with water, and ayin with an eye. An ox, a house, water, an eye. These quiet images may stand behind some of the letter forms that emerged later. Yet the path is not perfectly preserved. The early forms vary, and their readings are not always secure. The relationships between the inscriptions remain debated. Much must be reconstructed from a very small amount of evidence. The signs themselves often looked quite different from the letters familiar to us today. An early ox head form would not immediately appear to be a modern capital A. The resemblance becomes visible only when we consider a long process of change. Across centuries, signs could be rotated, simplified, and reinterpreted. Details disappeared, lines shifted position. A form copied by one writer might be turned by another. As writing passed between communities and languages, old shapes were adjusted to new habits and new needs. There was no single moment when an ancient picture suddenly became a modern letter. Instead, each form moved gradually through time. The changes accumulated slowly, from one inscription to another, and from one writing tradition to the next. These early alphabetic scripts also differed from the way modern English writing records language. They generally represented consonants rather than giving every vowel its own separate full letter. A reader supplied much of the missing vowel information through knowledge of the language and the surrounding words. For someone who knew the language well, such a system could be practical. Familiar patterns and context helped the reader understand what was intended. The written consonants provided a framework, while the reader's knowledge supplied what was not fully marked. We should not imagine that one complete and orderly system appeared all at once. The inscriptions from Wadi el-Hol and Sarabat el-Qadim are sparse. Their exact dates, relationships, and readings continue to be discussed. Some signs may reflect different stages or local traditions. The route from these early inscriptions to later Canaanite and Phoenician scripts is reconstructed from limited evidence. It is not a smooth road preserved step by step. It is more like a trail glimpsed at intervals. For a while it is visible upon the stone, then it disappears beneath the sand, only to emerge again farther on. This partial view is enough to reveal an important possibility. Semitic-speaking writers seem to have selected signs from the rich visual world of Egyptian writing and used them according to the sounds of their own language. Through the acrophont principle, a pictured object offered its first consonant. A sign suggesting a house no longer had to mean only house. It could carry the B sound into many different words. A picture had become a tool for representing speech. The surviving marks do not tell us precisely who first tried this method, or whether several people made similar adaptations in different places. They do not preserve a single inventor's name. They do not give us one clear date on which the alphabet began. Instead, they suggest a gradual experiment carried out within an already literate world. Egyptian signs were present. Semitic languages were spoken. People met, observed, remembered, and adapted. From that setting came a way of writing that was smaller in its set of signs and flexible in its use. There is something restful in allowing the evidence to remain incomplete. History does not always offer a full inscription with every line unbroken. Sometimes it gives only a few shallow grooves, their edges softened by time. From those grooves, careful study can recover not every detail, but the shape of an idea. The idea was that a sign can stand for a sound. That principle would become one of the foundations of the alphabetic traditions that followed. Yet these early inscriptions were not the modern alphabet, nor were they a finished version of the Phoenician, Greek, Latin, or English scripts. They were earlier forms, still varied and uncertain, shaped by contact between languages and writing traditions. Evening settles gently over the sun-warmed rock. The shallow grooves begin to cool. Dust rests in the carved lines. A few sparse signs remain upon the surface, their makers unnamed, and their exact messages only partly understood. One sign may suggest a head, another perhaps a house, another may recall water or the open shape of an eye. Their pictorial origins are distant, but the deeper change is becoming visible. Each image can loosen its bond with the object it once represented and begin to carry a consonant sound. Over time, these scattered alphabetic traditions became more regular. Their signs were copied, simplified, rotated, and placed into increasingly recognizable sequences. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the forms became easier to use and easier to carry from one community to another. The faint ox, house, water, and eye were beginning a long journey. Ahead lay the more regular letters of Canaanite and Phoenician writing, where scattered signs would gather into a compact and widely adaptable tradition. Chapter 4. The Phoenician Letter Road. Along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, the varied experiments of earlier alphabetic writing gradually settled into more regular forms. Signs passed from one hand to another and from one surface to the next. Their shapes became more familiar. Their order became easier to remember. By around 1050 BCE, surviving inscriptions preserve a writing tradition that scholars can clearly recognize as Phoenician. Phoenician was not the first alphabet without qualification. Earlier alphabetic evidence already existed, nor was Phoenician the only alphabetic tradition in the region. Across the Levant, Neighboring communities used related sets of signs for related languages. The surviving record is incomplete, and many quiet stages of development have disappeared. Phoenician is especially important because it became one influential and well-attested branch of this larger family. Its letters appeared in a recognizable sequence, carried familiar names, and traveled widely enough to become ancestors of later alphabets. Phoenician-speaking communities lived along the eastern Mediterranean coast. Their settlements looked outward toward the water, where harbor air moved around wooden hulls and ropes rested in loose coils. Ships traveled between coastal communities, carrying goods and bringing people, languages, and customs into gentle contact. Folded cloth and marked containers waited in storage rooms. Craftspeople shaped ivory and metal. Pottery stood in orderly groups, ready to be used or carried elsewhere. Among these ordinary objects, a practiced writer might add a name, a dedication, or a brief record. It would be too simple to say that Phoenician merchants invented the alphabet solely for trade. Alphabetic writing had deeper roots, and people wrote for many reasons. They marked ownership, honored deities, remembered the dead, identified rulers, and recorded parts of civic and personal life. Trade did, however, create many opportunities for writing practices to be seen, copied, and adapted. The spread of Phoenician letters did not begin with one celebrated voyage or one decisive event. It happened gradually through repeated contacts over many years. A visitor might notice an inscription in a harbor. A craftsperson might copy a mark from a vessel. A writer might learn a sequence of signs and then show it to someone else. A community receiving these letters could adjust them to suit its own language. Across years and generations, the script moved quietly from place to place and from hand to hand. Only a small part of Phoenician writing has survived. Stone, pottery, ivory, and metal can preserve marks for a very long time, especially when sheltered in ruins or covered by earth. Yet much ordinary writing may have been placed on perishable materials. Those surfaces decayed, taking their words with them. A brief list or message might once have appeared perfectly clear beneath lamplight. It could be read, folded, stored, or set aside. Then, through the slow passage of centuries, the material might weaken and vanish. The words would disappear even though the writing tradition continued. What remains includes inscriptions cut into stone, scratched into pottery, and carefully placed on precious objects. Some are formal and prominent, others are very small. Even a short line can reveal the steady motion of a practiced hand. Phoenician was normally written from right to left. To a reader accustomed to modern English, this direction may at first seem reversed. Yet the direction of writing is simply a learned convention. Once it becomes familiar, it feels ordinary. Beneath the soft flame of a lamp, a Phoenician writer could begin at the right edge and move toward the left, forming one sign after another. The hand followed its expected path, just as an English writer now moves from left to right without needing to pause and consider the direction. The Phoenician alphabet contained 22 letters. Compared with writing systems that used hundreds of signs, this was a compact set. Compactness did not make Phoenician inherently superior to other forms of writing. Systems with many signs could express language with richness and precision, and they served their communities well. But a smaller collection of symbols could be learned, remembered, copied, and adapted with relative ease. That quality helped alphabetic writing move between communities. Phoenician letters primarily represented consonants. Consonants are sounds such as B, M, T, and S. They are made by narrowing or briefly closing some part of the path through which the breath travels. Vowels, such as the sounds represented by A, E, and O in modern English, are formed with a more open flow of air. Modern scholars often call Phoenician an abjad. This is a modern technical term for a script that chiefly records consonants. Ancient Phoenician writers did not use the word abjad to describe their own writing. Phoenician and related scripts did not normally record vowels as independent, consistently required letters in the later Greek manner. This did not mean that spoken Phoenician lacked vowels. The spoken language contained the sounds and rhythms known to its speakers. The writing simply left much of that information for readers to supply. Knowledge and context helped. A reader familiar with the language could look at a sequence of consonants and infer the intended word. Common expressions, personal names, grammar, and the subject of an inscription narrowed the possibilities. Modern readers do something a little similar when they understand a shortened note or a familiar abbreviation. Information that appears missing may be quietly restored through experience. What seems uncertain to an unfamiliar reader might have been immediately clear to someone who knew the language and its patterns. The sequence of Phoenician letters also carried a lasting inheritance. The first few names were Aleph, Beth, Gimel, and Daleth. These names had histories reaching into earlier alphabetic traditions. As the signs later entered Greek-speaking communities, the names became Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and Delta. Farther along the road, their forms and functions contributed to the ancestry of modern A, B, C, and D. The connection is not equally direct in every case. Letters change shape, some change sound, and some were given a new purpose. Yet the old sequence remains surprisingly durable. The familiar beginning A, B, C, D still carries a distant echo of Aleph, Beth, Gimel, and Daleth. The letter shapes did not remain still. A sign cut into stone might be angular, with firm lines suited to carving. The same sign written in ink might become smoother. A mark scratched quickly onto pottery could lean, shorten, or open slightly. Each material invited a different kind of movement. A small inscription on ivory might require patience and precision. A mark on metal might be pressed or cut with care. On pottery, a sign might be scratched before firing or added later to a finished surface. In every case, the writer worked within the possibilities of the material. Each new community also brought the habits and sounds of its own language. An alphabet was not a sealed object, delivered unchanged from one people to another. It was more like a compact set of tools. Those who received it could select, turn, and reshape its signs. They preserved what seemed useful and altered what did not quite fit. This adaptability did not erase the alphabet's earlier history. Beneath every adjustment, traces of older forms remained. A sign might rotate, its lines might become straighter or more curved, its sound might shift. Still, something recognizable could continue through the change. Here then the earlier story gathers into a clearer pattern. Signs associated with sounds now traveled as a recognizable sequence. 22 consonant letters, usually moving from right to left, could be held in memory as well as marked upon an object. Their compactness helped them adapt, while maritime connections offered many quiet paths along and across the sea. No single journey carried the script everywhere. No single writer decided what all later alphabets would become. Instead, there were many encounters. One person learned from another. One community borrowed from a neighbor. A familiar sign appeared in a new place, where a different hand gave it a slightly different form. Harbor air moved between the buildings and around the wooden hulls. Goods rested in storage. A short inscription waited on stone, pottery, ivory, or metal. Beneath lamplight, a hand moved steadily from right to left, and beyond the harbor, the same water touched other shores. From the eastern Mediterranean, the paths of the letters extended westward toward islands and peninsulas, where Greek-speaking communities encountered Phoenician writing. The inherited signs would not remain exactly as they were. They were entering a language with different needs, and some Phoenician consonants did not correspond neatly to the sounds Greek writers wished to represent. So some of those signs were given another task. Along the western horizon, the sea rested beneath the evening light. On its farther shores, writers began to use certain inherited letters to record vowels. In that measured adjustment, the alphabet entered another stage of its long journey. Chapter 5. The Greek Edition. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the sea connected communities that spoke in different ways and wrote with different signs. Ships moved quietly between islands and harbors, carrying timber, oil, pottery, cloth, and metalwork. Along with these visible goods traveled less tangible things, names and stories, measurements and customs, and methods of writing. By approximately the 8th century BCE, Greek-speaking communities had begun adapting an alphabet related to the one used by the Phoenicians. The exact date remains uncertain, and scholars continue to discuss where and how this transmission occurred. It may have happened through several points of contact, as sailors, merchants, craftspeople, and neighbors met around the Mediterranean. There was no single morning on which the Greek alphabet suddenly appeared, complete and settled. Instead, people encountered useful signs. They learned their order and shapes, tried them in new settings, and gradually reshaped them for another language. The Phoenician alphabet had been developed for a Semitic language. Greek belonged to a different language family and had a different pattern of sounds. When Greek writers received the inherited signs, they did not simply copy them without change. They listened to their own speech and considered what the borrowed letters might do. Some Phoenician signs represented consonants that Greek speakers did not need. A letter that marked an important sound in Phoenician might have had no close equivalent in Greek. Yet its shape already belonged to an ordered system. It had a name and a place among the other letters. Rather than discard such a sign, Greek writers could give it a new purpose. Here, a quiet but important change took place. Every spoken language has vowels. Earlier peoples were not unaware of vowel sounds even when their writing systems did not represent them with full, separate letters in the same way. The Greek development was not the discovery of vowels, it was a change in how those familiar sounds were represented in writing. Several inherited Phoenician consonant signs were reassigned as Greek vowel letters. The Phoenician letter called aleph had represented a consonant produced deep in the throat. Greek did not require the sign for that same sound. Its place in the sequence was retained, while its value changed. It became alpha, representing a vowel broadly corresponding to A. A reader looking at the letter A today may sense a distant trace of this long history. Its form has turned and shifted through centuries of painting, carving, handwriting, and printing. Yet its ancestry reaches back, through Greek alpha, to an older inherited sign. Another Phoenician letter, he, was adapted in many Greek traditions as epsilon, representing E. Phoenician yod, formerly a consonant sign, became Greek iota, representing I, and Phoenician ayin, whose sound had no close Greek equivalent, became omicron, representing O. These examples reveal the method clearly. Greek writers did not create their vowel letters from empty space, nor did they simply add an entirely new collection of signs. They inherited existing letters and reassigned several of them according to the needs of Greek speech. Old shapes found new work. On pale stone, the adapted letters could be cut in clean, shadowed lines. On pottery, they might be painted before the clay was fired, preserving a name or a brief phrase on the finished vessel. On a wax tablet, a pointed stylus could press temporary marks into the smooth surface. Later, the wax might be warmed and leveled again, leaving a quiet space ready for a fresh sentence. The systematic use of vowel letters allowed Greek words to be represented with greater clarity. Consonants and vowels could stand beside one another, each given a visible place. This became a major development in the alphabetic lineage that would eventually pass through Latin, and much later into English. Yet early Greek writing was not uniform. Different Greek regions used different varieties of the alphabet. A sign might appear in one community, but not in another. The same shape could carry different sound values, while different shapes might be used for similar sounds. Regional inventories varied as communities selected and adapted the letters that suited them. These early Greek alphabets remind us that writing grows through repeated use. Neighboring communities may share a general system without making every choice in exactly the same way. A letter painted on pottery in one place might look slightly unfamiliar to a reader from another. A stone carver elsewhere might use a different form for the same sound. Writing direction also varied. Phoenician was generally written from right to left, and some early Greek inscriptions followed that custom. Other inscriptions moved from left to right, the direction familiar to readers of English today. Still others alternated direction from one line to the next. One line crossed the stone, and the following line returned in the opposite direction. This practice is called boustropedon. The word describes lines turning back and forth like an ox plowing a field. At the end of one furrow, the ox turns and walks across the field again, back toward the side from which it came. A stone inscription arranged in this way seems to move gently across its surface. The eye follows one line, reaches the edge, turns, and returns along the next. Sometimes the letters themselves were reversed so that they faced the direction in which the line was being read. Writing had not yet settled into one permanent path. In time, left-to-right writing became usual in Greek. Certain letter forms and inventories also became more widely accepted, but this happened gradually. There was no immediate agreement across every island, city, and coastal settlement. For a long while, several related traditions existed side by side. Meanwhile, Greek alphabetic writing found many purposes. Letters appeared in inscriptions naming people, recording ownership, marking dedications, or honoring the gods. They entered public records and civic life. They were used for literature, helping to preserve poetry and prose. They also served ordinary needs: an account, a label, a short message, or a practice line traced patiently into wax. In each setting, the alphabet became more deeply woven into the life of the language. Its forms changed with the materials and tools that carried them. A brush moved differently from a chisel, a stylus pressed into wax differently from ink flowing across a writing surface. Monumental letters on stone favored clear, measured shapes, while handwriting allowed curves and small variations. One may imagine a pale stone surface beneath an open sky, carrying rows of dark, clean-cut Greek letters. A painted inscription rests on a clay vessel after firing. Elsewhere, in softer lamplight, a hand draws a brief line into wax. The same general system passes through different materials, and each material leaves a quiet influence upon the form. The Greek adaptation therefore involved more than vowel notation alone. Letter shapes shifted, sound values changed, writing direction varied. Regional communities chose different signs and inventories. The alphabet was not merely passed onward, it was interpreted. This is one of the most enduring qualities of alphabetic writing. Its signs can remain stable enough to be recognized, yet flexible enough to enter a new language. A community may preserve much of an inherited sequence while adjusting individual letters to suit its own speech. A sign no longer needed for one sound may be given another task. Different hands may change its angle, direction, or value. By giving full and systematic written roles to vowels, Greek writers made the inherited alphabet especially well-suited to Greek. In doing so, they created an important turning point in the long lineage leading toward the letters used in English. The result was not instantly fixed or final. It remained varied, regional, and responsive to the people who used it. And because it remained flexible, it was ready to travel again. Along the western sea routes lay the shores of ancient Italy. Greek communities carried their regional letter forms there, not as one finished and unchanging system, but as several closely related traditions. The peoples of Italy would encounter those forms, borrow them, and reshape them according to the needs of their own languages. The wax could be smoothed once more. The pale stone waited beneath the hand of another carver. Across the water, new voices were ready to receive the signs, and the alphabet, altered by Greek speech and Greek writing, continued quietly westward. Chapter 6. Across Ancient Italy. Across the western waters of the Mediterranean, the coastline of ancient Italy curved beneath a mild sky. Mountains rose beyond the coastal plains, and paths led from sheltered harbors toward inland valleys and towns. Along these routes moved people, tools, stories, and customs. And among the things carried from one community to another were the small, adaptable signs of alphabetic writing. Greek-speaking settlers established communities in southern Italy. They crossed the sea with familiar ways of living and speaking, and they brought their writing traditions with them. Yet there was not one single Greek alphabet used everywhere in precisely the same form. Different regions of the Greek-speaking world had developed related varieties. A letter might have a different angle in one place, a different sound in another, or a different position among the local sequence of signs. The Greek forms most important to the early transmission of writing in Italy belonged mainly to Western Greek varieties. They were not simply the same as the later classical alphabet associated with Athens, which is often the Greek alphabet most familiar to modern readers. The letters that reached Italy reflected the particular communities whose writers carried them. They arrived through ordinary acts of memory and habit. A merchant might mark a container. An owner might scratch a short name beneath a ceramic vessel. A craft worker might place a careful inscription on a bronze object, its surface holding the muted gleam of metal in soft afternoon light. Writing rested on fired clay, stone, and bronze. Many messages were brief, yet even a few letters could remain long after the hand that formed them had disappeared. From the Greek communities of the south, letter forms traveled through the connected landscapes of ancient Italy. Coastal settlements exchanged goods and ideas with inland towns. Paths crossed fields and dry hills. Pale dust settled around the feet of travelers. Along these quiet roads, the alphabet moved again. In central Italy lived the people now known as the Etruscans. During the 8th or 7th centuries BCE, Etruscan communities began adapting a Western Greek alphabet for their own use. The precise details are not always certain. Much of what is known comes from surviving objects and inscriptions, and the evidence does not preserve every step. Still, the broad movement is clear. Greek letter forms reached Etruscan writers, and those writers made the forms useful in a different language. This was not a simple act of copying. The Etruscan language had a sound system unlike that of Greek. Every language arranges the possibilities of the human voice in its own way. A distinction that matters in one language may be unnecessary in another. A sound used often by one community may not appear at all in the speech of its neighbors. When writing passes from one language to another, its letters rarely keep all their earlier duties unchanged. An Etruscan writer encountering an inherited alphabet found both useful signs and signs that did not fit as neatly. Some letters represented Greek sounds or distinctions that Etruscan did not need in the same way. Such letters could be left unused or retained only for limited purposes. Other signs could be selected, adjusted, or reshaped to suit Etruscan speech and writing habits. There is no need to follow every small alteration to understand the greater pattern. The signs arrived, they were observed, they were tested against the sounds of a new language, then they were made useful. This pattern had appeared before. Greek writers had reshaped signs inherited from Phoenician tradition. They had given some signs new work, including the clear representation of vowels. Now Etruscan writers approached Greek forms with the same practical freedom. They did not receive the alphabet as something fixed beyond change. They treated it as a collection of possibilities. For this reason, the Etruscans were not merely passive intermediaries between Greece and Rome. They were active participants in the alphabet's history. They selected, preserved, altered, and reassigned signs. Though many of the shapes had come from elsewhere, Etruscan writing became a system fitted to Etruscan needs. A short inscription beneath a vessel may appear modest. It may contain only a name or a few carefully scratched marks. Yet such an inscription can quietly reveal how people wrote in a certain place and time. It may preserve the direction of writing or the form of a particular letter. It may show that a sign was known in one community, or that writing habits traveled between a coastal settlement and an inland town. Other inscriptions remain on stone and bronze. Their letters may be sharply cut or lightly incised, small human marks resting on materials that have endured for centuries. The Etruscan language is partly understood through these inscriptions, but much remains difficult to interpret. Scholars can recognize and read the alphabetic signs, and portions of the language can be understood. Yet many features of Etruscan, and the meanings of many surviving texts, remain uncertain. The shape of a line may therefore be clear while its complete message remains distant. The letters can stand before us, visible and orderly, while some of the thought behind them stays beyond reach. It is rather like hearing a voice from across a broad courtyard. The sound is present, but not every word arrives distinctly. Even so, the place of Etruscan writing in the alphabet's history is clear. It belonged to a broad network of writing traditions across ancient Italy. Within that network, the early Romans would eventually encounter and adopt alphabetic writing. The Romans acquired their alphabet through the traditions around them, especially Etruscan traditions, while Greek influence continued. This movement into Latin was not necessarily one perfectly straight transfer, as though a finished alphabet passed through only 2 or 3 pairs of hands. Cultural exchange usually follows several paths at once. People traded, they traveled between settlements, they learned customs from neighboring communities. Writing could move with an object, a craft, a personal name, or a practical need. Greek traditions remained present, Etruscan traditions became especially important, and the written landscape of Italy included several communities using related forms. The route toward Latin was therefore less like a single road, and more like a group of paths meeting near the same town. One path led from Greek settlements in the south, another passed through Etruscan communities in central Italy. Other paths connected the neighboring peoples of the peninsula. Along each route, signs could shift beneath a new hand. An angle might open or close. A letter might keep its shape but receive a different task. Another might become unnecessary and fall from regular use. None of these changes needed to happen all at once. They could gather gradually as generations of writers repeated what they had learned and adjusted what no longer suited them. This is one of the calm, recurring patterns in the alphabet's long journey. Communities borrow signs, but they do not borrow them without thought. They examine the signs through the habits of their own speech. They decide which are useful, which require a new purpose, and which may be set aside. The result is both inherited and new. The Etruscans received letter forms shaped by Greek use. They placed those forms beneath vessels and across pieces of bronze. They carved them into stone and carried them between settlements. The alphabet became part of their own writing habits, adjusted to a language different from the one that had first brought the signs across the sea. And beyond the Etruscan towns, Rome was gradually emerging among the communities of central Italy. Roman writers would take up alphabetic writing from the traditions around them. Etruscan influence would be especially important, while contact with Greek writing would continue. In Roman hands, many letters would eventually assume forms that seem increasingly familiar to modern eyes. They would be cut into monuments and written on everyday surfaces. They would be traced by practiced hands and repeated by learners. Straight strokes, open curves, and balanced angles would settle into recognizable patterns. Yet even the Roman alphabet was not the complete set of 26 letters used for English today. Some now familiar letters were still absent. Others had not yet separated into the distinct forms and functions they would receive centuries later. The journey was continuing. For now, Latin waited quietly in the distance. Behind it lay the southern Greek settlements, where regional alphabets had reached Italian shores. Nearer stood the Etruscan communities of central Italy, where inherited forms were examined and adapted for another language. Between coast and inland town, the signs moved along paths of fired clay, pale dust, carved stone, and muted metal. They arrived, they were considered, and once more, they were gently fitted to the sounds of a new language. Chapter 7. Letters of Rome. Along the roads of central Italy, the alphabet entered another language and another long season of change. The people of Rome learned from the writing traditions around them, especially those of the Etruscans, whose letters had come through Greek influence. Roman writers did not merely copy what they received, they adjusted shapes, spellings, and uses until the alphabet became better suited to Latin. The earliest known Latin inscriptions appear from around the 7th or 6th centuries BCE. They survive on objects that endured by chance: pottery, metal, stone, and personal belongings once held in ordinary hands. Some are difficult to date. Others are so brief or worn that scholars disagree about how they should be read, or even whether every mark is truly Latin. That uncertainty is part of their great age. A few faded strokes may be all that remain of a name, a dedication, or a statement whose original setting has long since disappeared. We can look at the marks, compare them with other examples, and listen for an ancient language beneath them. Yet some questions remain open. These early texts did not always resemble the stately inscriptions now associated with Rome. Writing direction could vary, spelling had not settled into later habits, and letter forms could appear unfamiliar. The Latin alphabet did not arrive in Rome as a finished and unchanging system. It was used, altered, and reconsidered across many generations. One especially important change can be seen in the history of C and G. In early Latin writing, the letter C could represent sounds that later writers distinguished as C and G. To modern ears, these sounds are related, but clearly different. The beginning of cold is not the same as the beginning of gold. Yet the early Latin alphabet did not always mark that difference. A reader often had to rely on context and familiarity. Probably during the 3rd century BCE, C was modified by the addition of a small stroke. The resulting form became G. A traditional account connects this change with a Roman teacher named Spurius Carvilius Ruga. The story is often repeated, but the attribution remains uncertain. The exact hand that first made the distinction is unknown. It may be gentler and perhaps more accurate to imagine the new letter emerging from a practical need. One writer tried a small alteration, other writers found it useful. Gradually, the distinction became accepted. With one modest stroke, the alphabet could represent Latin sounds more precisely. Other changes reflected Rome's continuing contact with Greek language and culture. Greek words entered Latin, bringing sounds that were not always easily represented by the ordinary Latin inventory. The Greek-derived letters Y and Z were added or restored for Greek loanwords. They came to rest at the end of the Roman sequence, as though the alphabet had quietly extended itself to receive them. The classical Roman alphabet is often counted as 23 letters. Spoken slowly, it has a shape that is both familiar and incomplete. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, V, X, Y, Z. Most of these signs would be recognizable today. Yet 3 letters from the modern English alphabet are absent: J, U, and W. Their absence does not mean that Latin lacked every sound or function later associated with them. Rather, the distinctions were handled differently. The letter I performed duties that would eventually be divided between I and J. It could represent a vowel, and it could also serve a consonantal function. Much later, differing written forms and uses would become distinct letters. In classical Rome, however, they still belonged together under I. In a similar way, V carried functions later divided between U and V. Roman inscriptions commonly display the angular form V, even where a modern editor might print a U. It could perform both vowel and consonantal functions. Its pronunciation depended on context, and it also changed across time and place. The categories now treated as separate letters had not yet settled into their modern arrangement, and W had not yet appeared. Its name W preserves a quiet clue to its later formation. That fuller story belongs to a later time and to languages beyond classical Latin. For now, the Roman row remained at 23. When people picture Roman writing, they often imagine deep capitals carved into pale stone. A mason might plan the inscription carefully, measuring the available surface and arranging each line. Then the chisel would begin its patient work. Measured strokes entered the stone. Broad verticals met open curves and balanced angles. In sunlight, the carved grooves held narrow shadows, allowing the words to stand clear against the surface. Some monumental inscriptions separated words with centered dots. The small marks gave the eye a place to rest between one word and the next. Yet Roman practices were not entirely uniform. Spaces between every word were not always used consistently, and many texts allowed letters to continue in a nearly unbroken stream. Reading depended partly upon familiarity with the language and its patterns. The grandeur of carved capitals, however, represents only one part of Roman writing. Romans did not shape every text as though it were intended for a monument. Across Roman cities and settlements, painted notices appeared on plaster. Elsewhere, people scratched informal names, remarks, and graffiti into walls and other surfaces. These marks could be uneven and personal. They preserved quick movements of hands that may never have expected their words to remain for centuries. In quieter surroundings, a stylus moved over a wax tablet. The tablet was a shallow wooden frame holding a smooth layer of dark wax. The pointed end of the stylus traced letters through the surface. A broader end could smooth the wax again, allowing the same space to be reused. A calculation, a lesson, a draft, a list, or a private note could be written and then erased without requiring a new sheet of papyrus. The wooden stylus glided, paused, and turned. Fine wax gathered beside its path. Once the message had served its purpose, the surface could be made calm and level again. Letters formed in wax naturally differed from letters cut into stone. The stylus moved more quickly than the chisel. Lines could lean, join, shorten, or curve. Everyday writing asked for ease and speed rather than monumental permanence, and handwriting responded to that need. Ink offered another rhythm. A pen passed over a fibrous surface. The sheet bent softly beneath the writer's hand while the ink dried. Accounts, official records, literary texts, and correspondence could all take written form. A document traveling from one place to another carried language in the distinctive movement of a particular hand. Roman handwriting included many styles, from careful book scripts to rapid everyday writing. It would be misleading to imagine a single Roman alphabetic appearance. A capital on a public monument, a painted notice, a line on papyrus, and a hurried note on a wax tablet all belonged to the same broad writing culture, yet each was shaped by its material and purpose. Stone encouraged deliberate proportions. Paint followed the movement of a brush. A stylus pressed narrow paths into wax. A pen allowed ink to flow over papyrus. The letters remained related, but they did not remain identical. The familiar lowercase alphabet still did not exist as the paired system used today. Roman capitals were not simply uppercase letters waiting beside a complete matching row of lowercase forms. The smaller forms familiar to modern readers would develop later, growing from traditions of faster handwriting. As hands wrote repeatedly, gestures became rounded, shortened, and sometimes connected. Over long periods, these practical habits would help produce forms quite different from monumental capitals. Lowercase writing was not created in a single moment. It emerged gradually from the ordinary motion of writing. Even Roman-looking capitals in modern typefaces should not be mistaken for exact copies of ancient inscriptions. Designers have studied Roman carving and drawn inspiration from its proportions, spacing, and measured strokes. Yet a modern typeface belongs to another technology. Printed letters and digital outlines must answer to materials and methods very different from a mason's chisel meeting stone. The Roman alphabet, then, was never merely a fixed row of symbols. It lived in stone dust and wet plaster, in dark wax and drying ink. It belonged to formal inscriptions and private notes, to public words and temporary marks. It could stand high upon a monument or rest lightly upon a sheet of papyrus, and it continued to change, even while its deepest capitals seemed permanent. In time, the political world of Rome would recede, roads would weather, buildings would be altered and reused, inscriptions would remain beneath changing skies. Yet the letters did not disappear. They passed into new communities and new languages, carried through administration, trade, religion, books, teaching, and memory. The Roman world slowly faded into the distance, but its alphabet continued onward. Far to the northwest, in Britain, Latin writing would meet other traditions. Among Germanic-speaking communities, angular runes would also be cut into wood, bone, and stone. There, Roman letters would enter another period of adaptation, meeting a language whose sounds would once again ask old signs to take on new work. Chapter 8. Letters arrive in Britain. Across the narrow waters northwest of continental Europe lay Britain, an island of green valleys, wooded hills, long rivers, and coastlines shaped by the sea. Letters had reached these shores long before the English language took form. During Roman rule, beginning in the 1st century CE, Latin writing became part of life in Britain. It appeared in the work of administration and trade, on public inscriptions and military objects, and among the smaller marks of ordinary activity. Officials kept records. Messages traveled between settlements. Names were carved into stone or scratched into pottery. Through such uses, Latin letters became familiar in at least some communities. Roman administration in Britain ended in the early 5th century, yet Latin writing did not simply vanish. Old inscriptions remained visible, and objects marked with letters remained in the landscape. Knowledge of Latin also continued in some places, especially within surviving Christian communities in parts of Britain and Ireland. What changed was the network of institutions that had supported Roman government. As those institutions receded, the settings and purposes of writing changed as well. In the centuries that followed, Germanic-speaking settlers established communities and kingdoms in parts of Britain. Their speech would gradually develop into forms of Old English. They also brought, maintained, or developed another tradition of writing: runes. Runes often appear angular, with straight strokes well suited to being cut into firm surfaces. Their shapes follow naturally from the movement of a knife or chisel. A brief inscription might rest upon bone, follow the edge of a metal object, cross the surface of pottery, or appear on stone. Runes also survive on weapons and jewelry, where only a little space might be available for a name or a short sequence of words. The runic alphabet used in Anglo-Saxon England is usually called the Futhorc. Its name comes from the sounds represented by its first several runes, much as the word alphabet comes from the Greek letter names alpha and beta. Futhorc developed from an older Germanic runic system called the Elder Futhark. As runes were adapted for Old English, signs were added or altered to represent sounds that mattered in the language. Once again, an inherited writing system changed as it entered a new community. This was not a reform completed on a single day, nor was Futhorc one permanently fixed row of characters. Its inventory varied by period and place. Some communities used forms or distinctions that others did not, and the number of runes could expand as writers found ways to represent additional sounds. The term Anglo-Saxon itself covers several kingdoms, several dialects, and many centuries. Writing practices were therefore not uniform. A form familiar in one century might later be changed or forgotten. Like the wider history of the alphabet, the history of Futhorc was shaped by many local choices, quietly made over generations. Surviving runic inscriptions reveal a broad range of uses. Some preserve a name or only a few words. Others may identify an owner, a maker, or an object. Some commemorate a person. A number appear to have had ritual significance, while others remain enigmatic and difficult to interpret after so many centuries. Because runes are often associated with legends and magic, it is easy to imagine that they were used only for mystery or enchantment. Their actual purposes were wider and more ordinary. A rune could carry a simple name as readily as a solemn formula. It could identify a possession, preserve a memory, or mark the work of a craftsperson. The same writing tradition could belong to practical life, ceremony, commemoration, and belief. Meanwhile, Latin writing was entering a new period of growth. In the year 597, the Christian mission associated with Augustine of Canterbury began. Augustine and his companions arrived from Rome and established their mission in the Kingdom of Kent. Their work became part of the gradual conversion of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, a process that unfolded unevenly over many years. Augustine did not bring the first writing ever seen in Britain. Latin literacy had existed during Roman rule, and Christian traditions had survived in parts of Britain and Ireland. Rather, the mission associated with Augustine, together with other Christian communities and institutions, helped Latin writing expand into new settings and among new peoples. Churches and monasteries became important centers for literacy. Within their walls, books could be read aloud, studied, taught, copied, and preserved. A manuscript required long and patient work. Parchment was prepared, pages were ruled with faint guiding lines. Then a scribe dipped a pen into ink and formed one letter after another, allowing each word to settle into its place. Latin was the language of many religious and learned texts. Yet Latin letters could also be used to record English. This required care, because Old English included sounds for which the inherited Roman alphabet did not always provide an obvious sign. Scribes adapted what they had received. They experimented, borrowed, and adjusted, gradually finding ways to place English speech upon the page. In Britain and Ireland, scribes developed distinctive styles of handwriting now known as insular scripts. The word insular means of the islands. These scripts could look quite different from runes cut into hard surfaces. The motion of a pen allowed letters to curve, turn, and flow across parchment. Line after line could gather beneath the scribe's hand, while the ink slowly dried. The contrast is gentle but clear. On one object, firm angular strokes might be cut into bone, metal, pottery, or stone. On another, rounded letters might rest in ink upon a manuscript page. The materials encouraged different movements. The knife pressed and lifted. The pen glided and paused. Yet it would be misleading to imagine two entirely separate worlds, with runes on one side and Latin letters on the other. Latin script did not immediately replace runes. The two traditions coexisted for centuries. A person might encounter runes on a small possession or monument and Latin writing in a church book. Different communities, languages, materials, and purposes encouraged different choices. Nor did every region follow the same path. Across the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, customs changed from place to place and from one period to another. Teachers traveled, books crossed land and sea. Scribes learned from manuscripts brought from elsewhere. Christian traditions in Britain and Ireland continued to shape the use of writing, while connections with continental Europe brought further examples and influences. Through these quiet networks, Latin manuscript culture became increasingly established. Monasteries copied books and taught literacy. Churches needed texts for worship. Writing preserved words beyond the moment of speech, carrying them toward readers separated by distance or by time. Still, the angular runes remained. They could appear on objects and monuments, sometimes in settings that also reflected Christian life. Their continued use reminds us that writing systems do not always follow one another in a neat succession. An older tradition may remain useful, while another grows more common. Communities can draw upon more than one way of writing at once. And so in early England, two broad kinds of lines shared the landscape. There were the firm strokes carved into durable objects, and there were the flowing letters placed in ink upon parchment. Neither tradition was perfectly uniform. Neither changed all at once. Both responded to the sounds, materials, and needs of the people who used them. From this long coexistence, the written forms of Old English would emerge. The Roman alphabet supplied much of the framework, but it was not sufficient by itself. English speakers needed signs for sounds that Latin had not represented in quite the same way. In time, several distinctive letters would come into view: thorn, eth, ash, and wind. They would make an Old English page look at once familiar and strange, like a remembered pattern gently altered. In those letters, Roman forms, English sounds, and the enduring memory of runes would meet upon the page.